Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about samurai warfare, culture, and life during the Warring States period. We've been following the political narrative pretty closely, and we will get back to that next lecture. Today, what I want to do is kind of fill in as many of the gaps as possible in giving you a picture of what this world of the Warring States period looked like and how samurai experienced it. First of all, it must be said that one of the most important developments was a shift in the way of fighting. We have been used to looking at the samurai as individual warriors, people who attracted followers to them based on their charisma, and then led groups of retainers in battle. And that was still true to an extent, but samurai really adopted new ways of fighting, or adopted many elements of new ways of fighting that, while they remained individuals in their personalities, they now fought much more as a unit. And in particular, they became something akin to an officer class. Not exactly, but samurai now, in addition to having retainers who did serve them and who were hereditary, who passed their positions on to their sons, samurai now also commanded units of conscripted commoners very often. These commoners are termed ashigaru, basically foot soldiers, and they were either taken by force or many of them signed up by choice, and they were grouped into units armed with rather simple weapons and armor. You see here they are armed with bows. They were banded together into these kinds of units. If you shoot a volley of arrows, it looks very impressive, and it's also very effective, even if the aim of the individual in the unit is the individuals in the unit isn't really what you'd expect from a samurai who's trained his entire life for this. The point wasn't to single out an opponent and kill him. The point was to lob arrows into other masses of troops, and for that, commoners trained with very basic methods, they were good enough. So samurai were in charge of these units, some of them, as I said, armed with bows, many of them armed with large pikes, spears, basically, and except very large ones, and taught to fight as a group, and they also carried swords, as you can see here, cheap mass-produced swords, and armor that was could be very basic, could be almost good, but was never the top quality that you'd accept from samurai. You know, for example, no shoulder pads, just these little bars of iron or reinforced hide. These chest armor pieces, some of them were metal, many of them were made from pressed paper lacquered over. So these were basically cannon fodder. But if you used large units of commoners on the battlefield in certain ways, if you had archers backed up with spears, they could be very effective in facing off even better armed and better trained samurai, especially people who galloped in on horseback. Horses will not willingly charge into a row of spears, whereas humans, you know, we do that all the time. So really, who's the smarter animal? But the point is that you could use these not half-trained, but barely trained troops, and by weight of numbers, you could crush your enemies. And samurai were involved in this kind of fighting, oftentimes ever more so, rather, by commanding these units of ashigaru, commanding these units of commoners, rather than themselves going out and trying to pick fights with famous warriors, although certainly that never ended. That kind of personal form of combat was a part of samurai combat down to the very end, down to the mid to late 19th century, really. And many of these samurai were also responsible for drilling these ashigaru and for provisioning them. So it was kind of a way to build on the feudal social structure of the samurai lord and his vassals, and these vassals commanded their own armed bands of these commoners, and by adopting this way of fighting, many of these Sengoku daimyo, many of these Warring States era daimyo, really saw to it that the size of their armies ballooned. The more commoners you have under arms, and samurai certainly, but basically the more people you have under arms, the more successful you'll be, and you got to the point where armies got so large that oftentimes the deciding factor in how a war would go was not success in battle, but economics. If you couldn't provision enough men for this increasingly large army that you have, you were going to have to leave the field. Your peasants are going to have to go back to farming, and you will lose. So resources, logistics, kind of things that help armies behind the lines, they became ever more important during the Warring States period. And the resources of all of these essentially small kingdoms that the daimyo ruled were mobilized to support all of these increasingly large armies. So armies were becoming a major drain on funds, and castles even more so. Positional warfare, that is, warfare not out in the open field, not two armies coming together and fighting each other, but sieges. Samurai and these new units of commoners, these ashigaru, holding up inside castles and trying to wait out their opponents, or hopefully daring their opponents to attack a castle so that they could throw them back, and the army besieging the castle trying to wait out the besiegers, or hoping to capture a castle by force, or possibly burn it down, or somehow make it so that the defenders had to surrender. This was always a very important way of fighting. Pretty much everywhere that we can that we have historical sources for, this kind of positional warfare, and in Japan certainly it was the same way. Castles were first and foremost defensive works. They had to provide a place of refuge where samurai could run to if they were if they came under concerted attack. Let me show you. Let's go through this example, this illustration of Edo Castle. Now, Edo Castle, by the way, just to ruin the surprise, the person who who unified Japan eventually, Tokugawa Ieyasu, founded a capital in the fishing town of Edo, which is in eastern Japan, and now you know it as Tokyo. But he basically had this blank slate to work with, this place where there wasn't very much human activity, and he could plan a truly magnificent castle. So Edo Castle is by far the most impressive castle built during this actually, the reason this is a little bit difficult is because it was built immediately after the end of the Warring States period, but it shows you a lot of the same techniques that were used by contemporary castle makers. So let's take a look at this bottom illustration. You'll notice that this castle is mostly walls. It's not like a European castle where the castle is basically it kind of looks like, well, I mean, I think most of you, if not all of you, have seen them. Very tall towers, relatively thin but very, very high walls. These castles, Japanese castles, looked more like a series of walls that hid pretty much all the inner structures from sight if you're approaching them from the outside. Walls and these guard towers. And the thing that really distinguished them from other castles, in the European or Middle Eastern tradition, was that mostly Japanese castles were made of dirt. The walls were actually, you saw them and they were impressive and they were lined with stone, but they weren't actually stone. They were earth. Think of Japanese castles as a wedding cake with layer upon layer of earth holding, being braced by these stone facade walls, holding a multitude of towers from which defenders can rain missiles and projectiles down at you, and not as a really impressive stone house. That's really not what they were. You were supposed to build these castles usually with a moat, and on a place that would kind of aid the defenders. So you built them initially on mountain tops, and this is characteristic of early Warring States period castles. You just lopped off a bunch of the mountain, and voila, you had these layers of earth, which you lined with brick. I'm sorry, not brick, with stone. You threw up some towers, and a mountain provided you with a very defensible position that people would be very hard-pressed to take. Later on, as daimyo became a little more secure in their holdings, castles moved down a little bit from real mountaintops to the to hills. So mid-Warring States period castles are on hills, and why is that? Because you can build a bigger castle, a more impressive castle. You still have the hill to work with, to carve into this defensive shape. But you're closer now to major population centers, to major farmlands. A lot of these were in valleys instead of on mountain peaks. And you were trading a little bit of the natural defensibility for convenience, and you were turning the castle into a real strong administrative center, as well as a defensive position. In late Warring States period castles, and Edo Castle especially, which was, as I said, built just after the Warring States period, many of the later castles, Osaka Castle is another example, Nagoya Castle is another example, they were built on flat land. And earth had to be carted in and shaped into this kind of a wedding cake-like arrangement, pounded down, and then stones brought in from a long way away. And why would people give up the natural advantages of height? Because the great warlords of the late Warring States period, the ones who had succeeded in defeating many of their neighbors and amassing a great deal of power, they could afford to do this. They could trade that natural defensibility for the effort of carting in all of that earth and placing their castle right in the middle of their most productive lands or of cities. With Osaka, certainly that was the case. So really, as the Warring States period went on, the concerns for just utilitarian defense gave way to other concerns. Or not gave way to other concerns, but certainly began to share room with other concerns, like the convenience of administration. Now, if you see the actual way that this castle was supposed to be defensible, was basically attackers were funneled in to killing zones. You were supposed to build these castles so that you could have intersecting arcs of fire. You could have, for example, people in this tower shooting at attackers going after the main gate, and they would be kind of taken from the side, and then from the front, and then from this tower, and from this tower, and as far away as this tower, people could rain missiles down on anybody who's attacking the gate. Going up the walls was also a very dicey proposition. These walls were pretty steep. It's not impossible to climb them. It's certainly possible to get grapnels and climb the walls that way, but you also had to deal with the moat. There were three types of moats. There were moats filled with water. There were completely dry moats, which was basically like a big ditch in front of the walls. And there were also moats that were kind of swampy. And these were actually the most difficult to traverse because you can't really swim across a bog in the same way that you can swim across water. These kinds of moats also give the rise to the legend of ninja, which we will be talking about. Ninja were actually real. These trained assassins and spies coming from these hereditary communities of assassins and spies, basically, that's what ninja were, who could easily swim across a moat or go up and down a dry moat. But when it came down to these swampy moats, they had to actually invent a tool that looked a little bit like a snowshoe, and on those they could get across the moat in the dead of night and go and steal some plants or go and assassinate somebody. But these castles were certainly very good at stopping large armies from getting over the walls or just breaking a gate in. And even if you did break in this main gate, you were immediately funneled into, if you look here, to a courtyard which is under fire, which would be under fire from 3 or even 4 sides. Then you'd have to either force this gate while under fire all the time, or go around and kind of get lost in a maze until you come to a secondary gate. All the while people from the top of the castle would be raining fire down upon you. And the walls would be harder to knock down as well, because they were not made of stone, they were just lined with stone to be harder. They were made of earth. So these castles were very, very impressive. And then by you get inside and you'd notice that most of the space inside is actually filled with low-lying buildings, palaces. This is the Ninomara Palace. It was in Edo Castle, it was a very, how do I say this, posh area of the castle, used for entertaining many important people. Here is the Ooku, which is the area where the wives and consorts of the shoguns lived. Kind of a women's area of the castle for highborn samurai women. And basically most of this space were these low-lying buildings, and these were built for luxury and to impress people. Because really all castles were in one way or another built to impress people. Built to impress them with their own opulence sometimes, and built to impress them also with the just the sheer military utility of this gigantic structure which you've managed to construct. Here is a reconstruction of the main keep, just this last area of defense, for a truly legendary castle that unfortunately does not survive, Azuchi Momoyama Castle, which was Oda Nobunaga's main castle. We'll talk about him more in the next lecture. Shows a mix of Japanese and continental inspired architectural styles. This is certainly very evocative of China, this middle story here.